So I often get asked by clients the variations of the same question along the lines of, am I normal? And the reality is that most probably, yes, you are completely normal. And I'll explain this by going through the neuroscience and what's going on in their brains. So we can start by simplifying the brain into two different components, the intellectual part and the primitive part. So we'll start with the bit that we know is ourselves, so the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the part that I'm using as I talk now, and that you're most likely using as you listen now. It's the rational, intellectual, and conscious part of our intellectual minds. The prefrontal cortex is attached to the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the subconscious part of our intellectual minds. It's like a vast intellectual resource library, like a bit like a computer database. So when we're working in this part of the brain, i.e. the intellectual part of the brain, we'll generally get things right. So it's positive and it always looks for solutions and answers based upon a rational assessment of the situation. And as I say, it generally gets things right. There's also another part of the brain, which I alluded to before, and that's the original primitive or emotional part of the brain. And this is part of the limbic system. So the limbic system is what runs all of our autonomic processes, such as your heart beating, breathing, all of that kind of stuff that we don't really give a lot of thought to. Now, the central and perhaps the most influential part of the primitive mind is the amygdala. So a lot of us have already heard of the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for that fight, flight, freeze response that we get when we're under some kind of pressure or, enforced stress. The amygdala works with two other very primitive parts of the mind. There's the hippocampus. So the hippocampus stores all of our primitive learned habits and behaviors, often inappropriate habits and behaviors. And then there's the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is responsible for regulating the chemical responses in our body and in our mind as well. So the primitive mind, its primary concern is to keep us safe and alive. In fact, that's all it cares about. It doesn't really care whether you're happy, whether you're feeling positive or feeling good about yourself. It just has that sole job of keeping us safe and keeping us alive. And it only has three possible emotional responses. So those are depression, anger, and anxiety, or a combination of all three. Because the primitive mind is just focused on keeping us safe and keeping us alive, it's a negative mind, so it always looks for the worst possible scenario. It's also an obsessive mind, and it's a vigilant mind. It's just constantly on the lookout for danger, and it's always on alert. So when we're feeling one of those three emotions, depression, anger, anxiety, or those emotions that we associate with those three, or we're feeling obsessive, we're obsessively thinking about things, overthinking things, ruminating on things, unable to move forward because we just can't stop thinking about things, perfectionism, all that kind of stuff. When we're negatively forecasting, catastrophizing about the future, we can be assured that we're working in the primitive part of the brain. And the primitive part of the brain is just doing its job. We all have the same brains. We all have a primitive and an intellectual part of the brain. Just unfortunately, the primitive mind isn't designed for the modern times that we live in at the moment. So the primitive mind can be activated when we come under some kind of stress or some kind of pressure. So as an example, imagine a bit of a silly example. Imagine that you walk out into the street this afternoon or this evening, and you bump into, say, a grizzly bear just walks in front of you. What would happen? Well, first thing that would happen is that you'd lose intellectual control. So you'd move from that intellectual part of the brain to the primitive part of the brain, because your mind would recognize that you're under some kind of threat. Obviously, your anxiety would go up. So your response would be that your heartbeat would start racing, you'd start to breathe heavily, you get hot and sweaty, your stomach might churn, and you'd run away quickly. And that would be probably a good response if you saw a grizzly bear. However, that response can be triggered by any kinds of events in modern day life. For example, you get an email from your manager last thing on a Friday asking for a meeting first thing on a Monday morning. It's strange how they have a habit of sending them at that time. Or you get an unexpected bill, or your pay slip significantly lower than you thought it might be. Obviously, these aren't life-threatening events. However, your primitive mind would see a grizzly bear in front of you, and it would react in that manner because the primitive mind, as I said, is designed for different times. So that's what's going on in our mind when we're feeling like that. It's perfectly normal behavior. It's just that our part of our brain was designed for different times. And the really good news is that once we've established that fact, and once we understand what's going on in our brain, then we're at a great starting point to start working with our brain, and we can start to work in different manners, and we can start to even build some new neural pathways, start to spend more time in this intellectual part of the brain, which is really good. It's a rational part of the brain. You're able to think with clarity. It's an intellectual part of the brain, so you're able to think creatively, think of new solutions, and move forward with your life. So I hope you've enjoyed that video. If you have any questions, please give me a shout. I'm always happy to talk through these concepts.